Our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, the co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, also now available as an ebook, and his Twitter handle, Prof Wolff, P-R-O-F, as in Professor Wolff, W-O-L-F-F. One of his websites is also rdwolff with 2fs.com if you want to check that out. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program. I want to ask this, but I don't want it to sound just like, facile, but is the gig up on the gig economy? I mean, are we seeing now the strengthening or the weakening of the gig economy? And maybe we should start out by defining it and how it fits into the realm of capitalism or regulated capitalism. As a consequence, in part of, for example, the pandemic, we're seeing all these gig economy workers who are getting screwed because they were, quote, independent contractors on the one hand. On the other hand, you're seeing efforts to give gig economy workers rights, which failed in California, but I believe succeeded in the United Kingdom. Correct me if I'm wrong, someplace in Europe. What's the deal here? Is the gig up on the gig economy?
Well, I think the answer is an unsatisfying yes and no. Let's start with what the gig economy is. Basically, it means an economy in which the relationship between the employer and the employee kind of changes from the typical one where you go to work for an employer, you sign a contract if you have a job with a union, sometimes even without a union, and then you're subject to a whole lot of laws and regulations that were built up over centuries as workers tried to get a better deal. For example, that there's an 8-hour day rather than a 12 or 16-hour day, that you have a certain number of bathroom breaks, that you get a few days off a year, that you get insurance, the variety of things that we nowadays call wage protection and benefit programs. So that was the typical thing. Employers always fought against every one of those, didn't want to pay for them, didn't want to be constrained by them. Workers had to go to all kinds of lengths, boycotts, strikes, job actions to get them. It's a long history. One of the ways, and here's the crucial part, one of the ways employers always dealt with this, if they lost the fight and the law was passed that they had to give an 8-hour day or give bathroom breaks or whatever, was they would accept it and then look for escapes. After the law was a reality, how do we evade the law, having delayed it for decades? And here comes the gig economy. By reclassifying a worker, that you're not an employee as you have been perhaps for decades, you are now a contractor. You are simply a person I enter into a deal with like I would with another business, and you are therefore just running your own gig. It's as if your labor became the product you produced rather than the capability you sold to me as an employee. And why would they want to reclassify you? Because if you weren't an employed worker on the payroll, well, then all the protections in the law for a payroll worker wouldn't apply. So a gig worker could be doing exactly the same thing he or she did before as an employee, but because they were reclassified as a gig worker, they didn't have to get 8-hour day. They didn't have to get bathroom breaks. They didn't have to do any of that. They didn't have to pay for workman's compensation. All of the other aspects of constraint won by the working class over decades and centuries could be evaded, and that's why it happened. It has nothing to do with the so-called sharing economy or with technological breakthroughs. It was an effort to re-establish the world as it was in the fantasy of employers before workers won all the protections that they have become accustomed to.
It's kind of pre-1880, more or less, or even before that.
Right. It's going backwards. And that's all it was. It was attractive to employers because it boosted their bottom line. They saved on all the costs of worker protection. That's why they did it. The rest of it was all window dressing, sharing, all that kind of, if you pardon me, a BS was designed to hide or to give opportunities to marginalized workers. All of this extra stuff was dragged in. It worked, by the way, in California with that voter action last year, which is sad, which fell for that kind of stuff. But I think in most of the world it is being discovered, certainly in European countries, but elsewhere too. It is what it is, and you're going to have to fight it one way or another if you're going to hold on to the protections that workers have come to. And as gig workers experience the way Uber and Lyft drivers have, the constriction of their income that they are now vulnerable to, they will become the very leaders of efforts to get for themselves what the workers' protections always were. And you can see the pressure on Biden to pass. Marty Walsh, the former mayor of Boston, issued that rule over the last couple of days. That's partly a response to the pressure that's now coming from these gig workers who are understanding what this ripoff always was.
You know, as a small business owner and an employer, I'm just astonished by this. I mean, one of the most expensive and difficult things for any company is turnover. You know, replacing an employee, having to retrain them and everything. And you know, we provide full health benefits. We provide, I think, reasonable pay. Our part-time workers, of course, are not getting the full-time, or you know, not getting health benefits. But but you know, it's I'm happy to comply with the labor laws and, you know, make sure that people are treated well, because I want them to stay with me. I mean, you know, this seems like stupid, frankly, in a way. I suppose if there's a large enough market of if you're talking low-skilled people, all they need to know how to do is drive a car, and you've got lots and lots of desperate people, you can exploit a lot of them for a long time. But isn't there a limit? Isn't there a point where this just kind of blows up and becomes something that isn't of advantage to companies? It
is, but Tom, here's how this works. You can suck a lot of people into these kinds of scams for a while. And I don't just mean the desperate worker who wants a little extra money with whatever car he can get his hands on, although that's part of the story. It's also the investors. Basically, these companies go to investors and say, hey, we've got a sure-proof profit deal. It won't last forever, but for the next few years, we're going to be able to offer people what is in effect a taxi ride without having to cover all the talks that a legitimate taxi company has had to cover, all of those laws protecting the taxi driver. We're going to get around them. We're going to be able to charge pretty much what the taxi fare would have cost, but without all the costs that a regular taxi company has. We're going to make a bundle. You can get in on it by buying a share or getting involved as a venture capitalist early on, and it'll be a very profitable business until history catches up with us, and we have to do for our drivers what taxi companies have had to learn to do with theirs. So it's a quick turnover kind of hustle. Yeah, amazing.